Hi everyone, Ainsley here from Small Fry Creations, and this week I'm building 4 table saw jigs out of 1 sheet of plywood with some accessories from the scraps and a box to store them in. Full disclaimer, this one's a second sheet of plywood. Let me show you how I did it. Today's project is part of the hashtag Summer Builds 2021, which was a challenge issued from Vic from Down Under Woodworks, and we had to make something mostly out of timber that reflected summer to us. And summer here in Australia is at the beginning and the end of the year. And the beginning of the year for me is all about trying to add efficiencies to the workshop and getting me set up for the year ahead. So for me, I want to add some jigs to the table saw because I think this is going to help me throughout the year. And just like all things in the Small Fry workshop, they must have a place to go so that I can put them away. So the build is going to start with a cabinet that is going to slide in under my table saw, and yes, that does mean that I am restricted with some of the dimensions that I can make the jig, but I think it's a good restriction to have because they're going to have a place to call home. So let's get started with the build. If you want to skip ahead to a certain jig that I have made, I will leave some chapters below so you can click ahead to what you want to see, but I think let's get building. Let's make some runners for our jigs, and I have got some old red gum floorboards which I'm going to use. I've measured my gap, and for me it's around about that 19 mil, so I'm going to cut them just over 19 mil and sneak up on that cut because you don't want any deflection in these runners so that when you're using the jig there's no movements left to right. So I need 5 in total across the 4 jigs, so once I've got it set and I know that it works, I can then cut all of them at that dimension. You could use plywood for the runners, but hardwood will last longer, so I went with hardwood. With the runners all cut, I could turn my attention to the first jig. The first of the 4 jigs we're going to make is a cross-cut sled, and I'm no genius, I'm not reinventing the wheel. All of these jigs already exist out there on the internet. The purpose of today's video is to show you how easily you can make 4 jigs from 1 sheet of plywood and save yourself hundreds of dollars in the process by not having to buy these jigs from a store. Now with the cross-cut sled, I'm going to keep it really simple, and where I want my thickness to be double, I'm going to glue all of those pieces together, and then I'll screw everything else together so that it just gives me some flexibility in the long run if I want to make any changes. So our first job is to cut our plywood oversized, and then we can get to the glue up. I started by cutting strips for the front and back of the sled. These pieces will be double thickness and will be 100 mil high. The main thing with this measurement is for it to be higher than the blade can go. The double thickness will help with strength and durability, and the base of the cross-cut sled is 675 mil by 558 mil. This measurement was based off the max size that I could fit in the storage cabinet. I rough cut all the pieces that were going to be glued, and I will trim them to size once the glue has dried. Trimming the pieces to size after the glue up will ensure for really nice square blocks. Okay, I think I've worked it out in my brain. I'm going to have 1 runner on this side of the sled as far across this way as I can, because then that means I get maximum cutting on the right-hand side. So now I need to take my piece of cross-cut that is going to be the back fence and rabbet out a section for my stop block. We're up to the part where we're going to attach the runners to the board. I'm going to use my fence of the table saw to help me keep it as square as possible. So I'll lock that in there. We want to raise our runners up. So we're going to do the old washer trick. Now the next trick is with the glue. We do not want glue squeeze out because that would be really bad. So I'm going to put just enough glue to hold it and then put this guy down. I can cut the rest flush later on, that's not an issue. Okay, the glue has been sitting for like 20-30 minutes. I'm hoping that is enough that I can lift this out ever so slightly flip it over. And now I can countersink and drill some screws into here just as some added support. I've got this leftover aluminium channel and I think I'm going to route it into the base of the cross-cut sled, and that will allow me to hold down material or just help with certain things. And I think it's the time to do it, because if I'm not going to do it now, I'm probably never going to do it. And I've got it sitting here, so why not put it to use? I'm going to work it out. I do need to cut them down, because if I've got a fence on the front and a fence on the back, I need to be able to get the bolts in to go into the channel. So I'm going to have to leave a section here so that I can actually get the bolts in, which is fine. But I think that's what I want to do. I've just screwed on the back fence in 3 different spots well away from the blade, and I'll put in a couple of more after that. I just wasn't 100% sure of where the blade was going to go. Now I can cut all the way through the sled, and then we can attach the front fence. I'll attach the front fence as square as I possibly can, then we'll run the 5-cut method and make adjustments from there. So let's get this cut through. I've got my digital gauge. Now there are a ton of 5-cut method videos out there on YouTube, and I am no scientist or mathematician, so I won't even go into the exact detail, but this is my layman's understanding of it. I've got my piece of timber here. I've labeled A, B, C, and D around. You cut a section of timber off all the sides, and then when you come back around to where you started from, you cut another section large enough that you can measure. I'm then gonna take my digital calipers and measure what I've got at the top and the bottom. I will also leave a link to a website that I found where you can actually just plug these measurements in. It walks you through and it tells you which way you need to move the fence up and back and by how much, to make sure that you can get it as square as possible. So I've taken my measurements here, I've plugged it into the calculator. I need to move my fence backwards ever so slightly. Now the main thing to remember is you do not want to be using the same screw, so don't take one screw out or your pivot screw out, move the fence and then use that same hole, because you're not going to be moving it that much and the screw is just going to end up going back into the same hole and you're going to end up with the same fence in the same spot. So we need to drill a new hole. I need to clamp it down to get it moved correctly. As by my calculations, I need to move it about 1 mil. So I'm going to move that backwards now, redo the 5-cut method and see if I can get even closer to squares. All right, I've now got it pretty close to square, or something that I am happy with. I've got my little stop block here, which is already made, and that can be screwed into place. And he is good to go. This block here is going to go and get stuck onto the back here, which will protect the blade when it is coming out. And then we can call this cross-cut sled done, and we can move to jig number 2. The next jig up on the workbench is what I'm going to call the picture frame sled, and this sled is going to be perfect for making those accurate 45-degree cuts. I've already got my board here, and I have already gone ahead and put my runners on because I was in the workshop early this morning and I couldn't make any noise, but I could get the runners on. This piece of board is already to its width, which is 500 mil. It just needs to be cut to its height, which is 350 mil, and that is because I want to get it into the cabinet. So I'm going to go ahead and set my table saw here to 350 mil and make that cut, and then we can start working on the top side, which is actually going to make the jig useful for making those picture frames or boxes or anything that you need to cut to a 45-degree angle. Again, for the blocks on the top of this jig, I doubled up the plywood just to make everything that little bit more sturdy. I rough cut all the pieces and got them into glue up. Again, once out of glue up, I trimmed all the blocks to final size. I've got my 3 blocks cut. Now something to note here, you need to take into account your thickness of your plywood and then have your blade up as high as it can and take that measurement to know how high you can cut your blocks. For me, it was around about 56 mil, so I cut mine to 55 mil, so I know I've got plenty of clearance. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, I haven't reinvented the wheel. I haven't made up any of these jigs. This jig is from Steve Ramsey, which he put out a video on a couple of years ago, and I will link that in the description below, but I think it's a really handy jig and one I'm going to use a lot in the workshop. Now I've got 3 blocks. I need one here for the back to protect my hands from the blade, and then the other 2 which is going to sit at a 45-degree angle. Our first job is to cut partway through our board here, and then we can start to lay out where our blocks need to go and get them glued into place. All right, I've made my cut all the way through, or part way through this board here. I'm gonna slide my jig in here. Make sure the table saw, of course, is in the off position and unplugged from the power. We don't need it accidentally starting up. I've got my 45-degree square here, and I've decided I'm gonna come down 150 mil from the top. That gives me good area for my material to sit in and gives me good variety for a whole bunch of different material to be cut at 45 degrees. So I'm gonna slide my 45-degree angle here up against the blade, and we're gonna make a mark here. So that is my 45-degree cut. I'm now going to glue my block in here, overhanging the side here. I'm gonna get it as close to the 45-degree mark as I can. You've just seen me cut this 45-degree, and I also then use this sled to cut this 45-degree here. And then this piece is gonna go over on this side, and I've got my framing square here because what's really critical with this jig is that this face is 90-degree with this face here. This joint up here is not super critical. This is what you wanna be worried about. So I've got my framing square here, and I'm going to put this up here with some glue on this side, and then I can make sure that that is perfectly sitting at 90. And just like that, the picture frame sled is all complete and it's ready for use. One important thing to note when you're using the jig, when you've got your 2 pieces, you want to have one running along this side to make your 45-degree cut, and then the opposing side running along here. That just makes sure that you're going to get those perfect 90-degree corners with your miters in between. So this jig is ready for its new home, and I say, let's move on to the next jig. The next jig up on the workbench is a tapering / straightening jig, and the best part about this jig is you're getting 2 uses out of the 1 jig. I've already cut my runner here, and I'm only going to use the 1 runner on this jig because if I need to, I will also use the fence on the table saw. I've got this guy here which will be useful when I want to make repeatable cuts, and I also am going to use some of this aluminium channel which is left over from the miter saw build, and I'm going to put them in this way because then you can use a whole bunch of different accessories, be it that you buy them from the shop or you make them yourself. I'm going to attempt to make my own hold down clamps out of the scrap plywood left over from the plywood that I used for this. Now, a tip that I picked up from Jonathan Katz-Moses recently is when you're using this channel here, I've only got 19 mil plywood, so by the time I channel this out, I haven't got a lot of meat to screw the channel down. So I'm going to super glue mine into place, and that should hold nicely and do the job. So we'll go ahead and work out where we're going to put those channels, route those in, and then we can start to talk about the different accessories that you can use with the jig. Now, I've also made sure that I've set my fence to 400 mils so that I will trim this piece ever so slightly, and then I know when I am going to use the fence, I just need to set it to 400. So it's a nice even measurement for me to set the fence to every time. The base of this jig is 670 mil by 400 mil, and again, this was designed so that I could fit it into the storage cabinet. Using super glue to install the channel was perfect. It's clean and it's strong, and I didn't have to use any screws. To make the hold down clamps, I cut some strips from the plywood 40 mil wide, and I glued a longer piece that was about 150 mil long to a shorter piece under it that was 100 mil long. On 2 of the clamps, I also glued a smaller block to the other side. I used my sander to flush everything up and round over the edges. I drilled a hole in the end of each clamp so that it could accept the bolt. And I also drilled holes for the bolts in the longer piece of plywood that will be used for the tapers and setting the jig for repeatable cuts. And just like that, the tapering / straightening jig is complete, and there's not a lot to it, but I do think it is one of those jigs that is uber helpful to have in the workshop. Let me run you through some of the accessories that I have made for it. I've got a really simple piece of plywood with some nuts and bolts running in the C channel, and I can lock this into place and I can use this for repeatable tapers, or I can use this for a repeatable straight cut, which is going to be really helpful. Now, I said that I wanted to use make my own hold down clamps, which I have done. I've got a couple of different options here, and I'm not 100% sure how these are going to work, and if I need to make adjustments as I use them, I will do that. I've got this guy here. He could be useful as a stop block or holding down thin material, and then I made a couple of these which can actually be used either way, holding down at different thicknesses of material. And the best part of these accessories is you can use these on my cross cut sled also, because I'm using the same C channel, so I think that's going to be really handy to have. These nuts and bolts that I'm using, I purchased a pack from Hare & Forbes quite some years ago now, but it's handy to have in the workshop, especially if you're knocking up jigs like this. So I can go ahead and get this jig in its new home, and we can move on to the next jig. The last jig in our 4 jigs out of 1 sheet of plywood is the spline jig. And if you have been a viewer of this channel for a while, you will have seen me use a spline jig before, and that is because I have built one previously. But there's a couple of things I don't love about this one that we're going to upgrade on the new one. So I'm going to go ahead and get my pieces cut. There are some critical measurements that you're going to need, but everyone's table saw is going to vary. So we'll go ahead and get those pieces cut, and then we can talk through some of the measurements that you'll need if you're going to build yourself a spline jig. The front pieces of the spline jig that will support the workpiece was doubled up plywood, so just like the other jigs, this one started with gluing the plywood pieces together. The main face of the jig measures 350mm wide by 300 high. This is one of those critical measurements that I was talking about. I've got my side pieces here already cut, and they are fine. The height is not super critical. I wanted it to sit just above my table saw. Now, in order to get the measurement for the piece to go across the top, if I just clamped these 2 pieces together and took that measurement, it's going to be really hard to move it up and down. It needs to have a little bit of space, but not too much. So I've cut a piece of paper out of my sketchbook and cut it into 4, so that's the thickness, and I'm going to put it on both sides so that it is even. Gently clamp this together and then take that measurement. That will give me just enough space for it to be able to ride along my table fence nice and square. Then we can get this top piece put on, and then we can attach the front. I've taken my faceplate off the jig just for the time being while I get these support pieces into place, but it was important to know where I was going to drill, and I actually will probably need to put some other holes because I'm going to cover them up, I've realized. So with the support blocks here, there's a couple of things to note. I have marked my board halfway across, and I have put a 45-degree line from that center point out on both sides. Now with the support blocks, you don't want them to be put all the way down the bottom here, because when you're actually using the jig, you want to be able to see where you're cutting, and if you've got your block all the way down here, you're going to block your vision. So we're going to put our blocks nice and high up here. Now this one here, you want to try and get as close to the 45-degree line as you can, but it's not as critical as this second block. When we go to put this second block in place, we'll use a framing square to make sure that this is exactly 90, so that when you are putting your splines in your material, it makes sure that it is nice and square and at 90. So we'll go ahead and get this first piece in, and then we can work on the second piece. With our faceplate now attached to the back of the jig, the spline jig is ready for use. So it simply slides over the table saw here and you can move it through the blade. So if we pretend that this is our piece of timber that we want to put the spline through, I can rest my piece of timber in here. I can also clamp it from both sides and then run it through the table saw. The only thing that's really important to note is that you want your blade not so high that it's going to go all the way through the workpiece. You only want to put the spline through the joint there. So you can move your table saw along, and just because we've put these blocks up a little bit higher, if you need to eyeball it, you can now see the workpiece. So this jig is all done, and that is the last of our 4 jigs out of 1 sheet of plywood. So now we can go and look at how we're going to put our jigs into the new home and store them away. In order to fit the storage box under the table saw, I had to make the box 750mm high by 450mm wide by 640mm deep. This will allow for 70mm casters. I made sure to lay out all of my pieces onto the plywood in SketchUp first to ensure that I made the most out of the plywood. My first job was to rough cut all the pieces for the box, and then I'll trim them to final dimensions later on. I rough cut the pieces first to make them a little easier to handle at the table saw. When it comes to trimming the pieces, I would set the table saw to one measurement and cut all the pieces. I would then move the table saw to the next measurement and make the next set of cuts. Making all the cuts at the same time ensures all the pieces come out at the same size. I pre-drilled with a countersink bit and assembled the box using 40mm timber screws. Before standing the box up, I installed the 70mm casters. I found some 7mm plywood that I had lying around from the dust collector packaging, and it was a good size for the back panel. Again, I just screwed the back panel on with some 20mm timber screws. With all the table saw jigs complete, I could go ahead and finish up the cabinet, and I just put in some really simple dividers so every jig now has a home. And my lovely wife took the time to paint the cabinet in the signature small fry design, so thank you very much. One thing I did want to run you through, down the side here I've screwed in some C-channel, and that can now hold my hold down clamps so they have a home. And I've just used some simple screws where I can store my push sticks, so now they have a home. So this cabinet is done and ready to have its jigs put in and wheeled in under the table saw, so we can call this project done. If you have liked this project, help me out by hitting those subscribe and like buttons, and I'll see you on the next one.